Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So, today we are checking out Kendall Walton's Fearing Fictionally. This is a very famous article about, obviously, our psychological states toward fictional entities. Walton begins this piece with a quotation from Aristotle's Poetics. The plot of a tragedy must be structured so that the one who is hearing the events unroll shudders with fear and feels pity at what happens, right? So Walton asked, then, do we have psychological attitudes toward characters in other mere fictions? Do we indeed get caught up in stories? We frequently become emotionally involved when we read novels or watch plays or films. But to construe this involvement as consisting of our having psychological attitudes toward fictional entities is to tolerate mystery and court confusion, right? And so he offers then this example that kind of frames the rest of his essay. He asks us to consider the example of a man named Charles who's watching a horror film about an entity like the Blob, right? In case you've ever watched that old horror movie, it's just a green slime, and uh, Charles, outwardly exhibits all the characteristics of fear. He sweats, he grips the arms of his chair, and then when the slime turns toward him, seemingly, he actually shrieks, and he even tells this man, "Was I scared?" Now, Walton asks, bottom of page 177, was Charles actually afraid of the slime? And he says, "I think not. Granted, Charles' condition is similar in certain obvious respects to that of a person frightened of a pending real world disaster. His muscles are tensed, he clenches his chair, his pulse quickens, his adrenaline flows. Let us call this psychological state quasi fear. But it alone does not constitute genuine fear." Why not? Well, as Walton goes on to point out, Charles doesn't exhibit any of the behaviors that we would associate with what we might call genuine fear. If Charles were in a situation where he believed that he was about to be consumed by a monstrous entity, he might try, for example, to flee, or barring that, to fight. But he doesn't do any of that, and he then asks us to consider another case. A lady, um, her name. One second here. Yes, uh, Frances, who was once attacked by a rabid dog, and she is visiting some friends who have an old dog named Fido, and Fido is one of those dogs, like most dogs, who wouldn't hurt a soul, but she's still afraid, and so Walton asks, "Well, is her fear fictional, or is this a genuine fear, right?" And he writes, "Frances genuinely fears Fido, right? Uh, But it is awkward to attribute to her the belief that Fido is dangerous. For one thing, she is perfectly happy to allow friends and loved ones to play with them, right?" And he notes, and this is the dilemma that we face whenever we're trying to talk about psychological states, right? Because we can only really, at least now, at the present point, generate or gauge, behavior. We can't know when, for example, in the brain something passes from a judgment or an imagination to a belief, right? It becomes a Sorites paradox where we're looking for the exact moment where there's a conceptual change. We can only gauge behavior, right? Even with MRI devices, etc., we can only gauge behavior. Um, Fear, genuine fear, can be attributed to Frances, even though she knows Fido isn't dangerous. But can genuine fear be attributed to Charles? Well, there's one other example that he wants us to consider. Um, Imagine there's a little boy named Timmy, right, and he's playing with his dad, and this is the bottom, page 181. Timmy's father pretends to be a ferocious monster who cunningly stalks him and at a crucial moment lunges viciously at him. Timmy flees screaming to the next room. The scream is more or less involuntary, and so is the flight. But Timmy has a delighted grin on his face even as he runs, and he unhesitatingly comes back for more. He is perfectly aware that his father is only playing, that the whole thing is just a game, and that only fictionally is there a real vicious monster after him. He, Timmy that is not really afraid, but it is fictional that he is afraid. Fictionally, the monster attacks. Fictionally, Timmy is in mortal danger and knows that he is. And when he screams and runs, it is fictional that he is terrified. Likewise, when the slime raises its head, spies the camera, and begins oozing toward it, it is fictional in Charles' game that he is threatened. And when, as a result, Charles gasps and grips his chair, fictionally, he is afraid. Now, what makes it fictional that Charles is afraid? Facts about Charles himself. He's an actor of a sort in his game, as well as an object. He's a reflexive prop, generating fictional truths about himself. In this respect, Charles and Timmy also are like actors portraying themselves in ordinary theatrical events. But I want to pose a counter to this right now. I had a friend once who we were watching a horror movie, and it was a slasher movie, right? And there was a scene when someone was getting killed, and this friend in particular was not much of a fan of horror movies, as myself and the other people in the room were. And I remember him very markedly saying, this is stressful. Uh, why would it be stressful given that he knew that he was in no danger whatsoever from the murderer right on the screen? Uh, if Walton's thesis that this is all quasi emotion, not genuine emotion, is true, right? Well, Walton, we'll let Walton have the last word here. This is 183. The fact that it is fictional that he fears does not automatically rule out his actually doing so, since fictionality and truth are not incompatible. But that fictional truth, generated in approximately the manner I suggested, preempts the phenomenological and verbal data, which might be explained by taking his fear to be actual. I think perhaps Walton is overstating his case. I mean, he does have a very good point. Behaviorally, Charles does not behave again in a manner that suggests that he is genuinely frightened, fearful for his life. Um, but nevertheless, people do experience genuine stress when watching horror movies. So, um, if in short, quasi fear is just that. It's not genuine fear. It nevertheless seems to be a rather potent kind of fear.